The Miracle of Atta, Peter Warner's discoverer. The runaway. Peter Warner was not supposed to be a fisherman. Born in 1931 in Melbourne, Australia, he was the son of Sir Arthur Warner, one of the country's wealthiest industrial tycoons and head of Electronic Industries Limited. His father had Warner's future mapped out: finish school, study law at the University of Melbourne, then join the family business empire. It was the path of privilege, security, and wealth. At age 17, Warner ran away to sea. He couldn't stand it, the stuffiness of upper-class life, the expectation that he would sit in boardrooms and manage accounts. The ocean called to him with a voice he couldn't ignore. When his father dragged him back home, Warner lasted 6 weeks in law school before running away again. This time he didn't return for 3 years, sailing with the Swedish and Norwegian merchant navies, eventually earning his Swedish master's certificate. By 1966, Warner had become everything his father feared: a professional sailor, yacht racer, and commercial fisherman. He had won the prestigious Sydney to Hobart yacht race 3 times aboard his schooner Aestia. He operated a small fishing fleet out of Tasmania, catching rock lobster, crayfish, in the waters around the Pacific Islands. On September 11, 1966, Warner was captaining his fishing boat Just David through Tongan waters, returning home from a fishing expedition. It was late afternoon, and they were passing near Atta, a small volcanic island about 100 miles south of Tonga's main island group. Atta had been uninhabited for over a century. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave traders had raided the island and kidnapped its entire population to work in South American mines. The island had been abandoned ever since, a desolate rock rising from the Pacific, covered in scrub vegetation and haunted by seabirds. As Warner scanned the island through his binoculars, something caught his eye. On the cliffsides, he saw patches of burned grass, dark scars against the green vegetation. In the tropics, Warner would later explain, it's unusual for fires to start spontaneously. Curious, and perhaps a bit concerned that the island might be harboring criminals, remote islands were sometimes used as dumping grounds for escaped convicts, Warner ordered his crew to bring the boat closer to investigate. As they approached the shore, a figure appeared on the cliff top. Then another. And another. 5 more figures emerged, all running toward the water's edge. They were boys. Naked boys with hair down to their shoulders, screaming and waving their arms frantically. Then one of them dove into the ocean and began swimming toward the boat with powerful strokes, what Warner called the Australian crawl. The other 5 followed, plunging into the water and swimming desperately toward the Just David. Warner and his crew stood at the rail, stunned. Where had these boys come from? How long had they been here? As the first boy reached the boat and grabbed the rope ladder, he called up in perfect English, "My name is Stephen. We are from Tonga. We have been here 15 months. 15 months. On a deserted island. And they were alive." Warner helped pull the boys aboard, one by one. They were thin but surprisingly healthy, sunburned, with long matted hair and beards, wearing nothing but ragged shorts made from woven palm fronds. Their eyes were bright with joy and relief. They told an incredible story. The adventure that went wrong. The 6 boys were students at St. Andrew's Anglican Boarding School in Nuku'alofa, the capital of Tonga. Their ages ranged from 13 to 19, and their names were Sione Fatawa, Kolo Fakito, David Tavita, Stephen Tavita, Luke Vakoso, and Mano Totau. In June 1965, they had grown hopelessly bored with school life. The strict Catholic institution felt like a prison to these island boys who had grown up with the freedom of the ocean. They wanted adventure, excitement, to see the world beyond their small island nation. So they hatched a plan: they would steal a boat and sail to Fiji, hundreds of miles away. Perhaps they would even make it to New Zealand. It was a reckless teenage fantasy, the kind of wild scheme that seems brilliant at midnight in a school dormitory. Their preparations were minimal. They packed 2 sacks of bananas, some coconuts, and a small gas burner. None of them owned a boat, so they decided to borrow one belonging to a local fisherman they disliked, a 24-foot wooden fishing vessel. On the night of June 14, 1965, they crept down to the harbor, untied the boat, and pushed off into the darkness. For a while, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The sea was calm, the stars were bright, and they were free. About 10 kilometers north of Tongatapu, they decided to anchor for the night and get some sleep. They were exhausted from the excitement and needed rest before continuing their journey. But while they slept, the weather changed. A tropical storm swept in with terrifying speed. The winds howled, the seas rose into mountainous swells, and rain lashed down in blinding sheets. The anchor rope snapped like thread. The boys woke to find themselves adrift in a raging ocean, their boat being tossed about like a toy. The storm destroyed their rudder and shattered their mast. Water poured into the hull faster than they could bail. They clung to the boat, convinced they were going to die, praying to survive just one more wave, then one more after that. The storm lasted for days. When it finally passed, they found themselves utterly lost. No land in sight. No navigation equipment. The small gas burner had been washed overboard. Most of their supplies were gone. For 8 days, they drifted without food or water. Some of the boys started crying. Others prayed. Mano Totau later recalled, "We tried to keep our hopes up, but I was worried we might die." They caught rainwater in tins they found on the boat, but they had nothing to eat. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. The younger boys grew weak and listless. On the 8th day, one of them spotted something on the horizon, a dark shape rising from the sea. Land. An island. But which island? They had no idea where the storm had carried them. For all they knew, it could be uninhabited or hostile. But they had no choice. They were dying of thirst and starvation. The wind and current carried them slowly toward the island throughout the day. By 11 p.m., they could see its silhouette against the stars, a volcanic cone rising steeply from the ocean. They approached in darkness, finally running the boat aground on a rocky shore. They had reached Atta Island. And there, in the darkness, their real ordeal began. Building paradise. The first night on Atta was terrifying. The boys were weak from 8 days without food. In the darkness, the island seemed hostile and alien. Strange sounds echoed from the cliffs. They huddled together on the beach, unsure what the morning would bring. As dawn broke, they began to explore. Atta was a volcanic island, rising steeply from the ocean to a forested plateau about 400 feet above sea level. The shoreline was rocky and treacherous, but there was a crude path leading upward. The youngest boy, Mano Totau, was sent to scout ahead while the others recovered from the voyage. What he discovered gave them hope. This island had once been inhabited. At the top of the plateau, he found remnants of the old settlement, a clay pot, a rusted machete, and wild chickens descended from birds the original inhabitants had raised over a century ago. Most importantly, he found food. Wild taro root. Banana plants growing in the forest. Coconut palms. And everywhere, seabirds nesting in the cliffs. The boys' first meal on Atta was desperate and primal. They raided seabird nests, drinking the blood of the birds and eating their raw eggs. It was revolting, but it gave them the strength to continue. Over the following weeks, they transformed from shipwrecked teenagers into something remarkable, a functioning community. The boys established rules and routines. They divided responsibilities. Some would fish, others would tend the garden they planted. Still others would maintain the fire and keep watch for passing ships. When arguments arose, and they did, the boys would retreat to opposite ends of the island to cool down, then come back together to resolve the conflict. They built shelters from palm fronds and bamboo. Without tools, this was painstaking work, but they persevered. The structures weren't much, but they provided protection from the tropical rains and gave each boy a sense of having his own space. Making fire was perhaps their greatest achievement. Using an ancient Polynesian technique called the fire plow, they created friction by rubbing a piece of sea hibiscus wood against a softer piece until it began to smoke. One boy would work the plow while others prepared tinder from dried coconut husk. When the first ember appeared, they carefully nursed it into a flame. That fire burned continuously for the next 15 months. The boys established a rotation where someone was always responsible for keeping it alive. It became more than just a source of heat and a way to cook food. It became a symbol of their survival, a beacon of hope. The boys also found ways to maintain their spirits. Using driftwood, half a coconut shell, and 6 steel wires salvaged from their wrecked boat, they built a makeshift guitar. In the evenings, they would sing together, hymns they had learned at school, traditional Tongan songs, anything to remind themselves they were still human. They created a badminton court, clearing a flat area and fashioning rackets from wood and vine. They built a makeshift gymnasium where they would exercise, keeping their bodies strong. They carved a wooden statue, just for the joy of creating something. Every morning and evening, they prayed together. Their faith, rooted in their strict Catholic upbringing, became a source of strength. They believed God would send someone to rescue them eventually. They just had to survive until that day came. The boys even maintained a watch system. 2 boys would always be stationed at the highest point of the island, scanning the horizon for ships. When they spotted one, and they did, several times, they would light signal fires, creating columns of smoke to attract attention. For ships passed by Atta during those 15 months. For times the boys lit their signal fires and screamed and waved from the cliffs. For times the ships sailed past without seeing them, disappearing over the horizon and taking the boys' hopes with them. Back in Tonga, their families had long since given up hope. Funerals had been held. Memorial services were conducted. The boys' names were spoken in the past tense. 6 promising young lives, lost to the unforgiving Pacific Ocean. But the boys didn't give up. They kept their fire burning. They kept their watch. And they waited. The discovery. When Peter Warner's boat appeared on the horizon on September 11, 1966, the boys almost couldn't believe it. Stephen, who was on watch duty, spotted the vessel first and immediately shouted to the others. They all raced to the highest point, waving and screaming. But the boat seemed to be passing by, just like the others. In desperation, Stephen made a decision. Without telling the others, he dove off the cliff into the ocean and began swimming toward the boat with all his strength. If the ship wouldn't come to them, he would go to the ship. Warner's crew spotted him in the water, a lone figure swimming toward them with powerful strokes. One of the crew members said he heard a human voice, but Warner dismissed it. No, it's all the birds. But it wasn't birds. It was Stephen, calling out in English as he approached the boat. When Warner's crew pulled the boy aboard, they were shocked. His hair was down to his shoulders, his body was lean and muscular from months of physical labor, and he was nearly naked. He spoke urgently. There are 5 more of us on the island. We've been here 15 months. Please, you have to rescue us. Warner thought it might be a trick. Remote Pacific islands were sometimes used to maroon criminals, and he worried this might be a ruse to board his boat. But something in the boy's eyes, the desperate sincerity, convinced him this was genuine. Warner brought the Just David closer to shore. 5 more boys appeared on the cliffs, and they too dove into the water and swam out to the boat. Warner and his crew helped them aboard, giving them water, food, and blankets. The boys were in remarkably good condition. They were thin but healthy, with no signs of disease or serious malnutrition. Their skin was burned dark by the sun, and they all had impressive beards for teenagers, but they were strong and alert. Warner radioed to Nuku'alofa to verify their story. 20 minutes later, a tearful voice came back over the radio. You found them. These boys have been given up for dead. Funerals have been held. If it's them, this is a miracle. As the Just David sailed back toward Tonga, Warner got to know the boys. They told him everything: the escape from school, the storm, the 8 days drifting at sea, their arrival on Atta, and the 15 months they had spent surviving on the island. Warner was astounded by their story. These weren't hardened criminals or trained survivalists. They were schoolboys, teenagers who had made a stupid decision and then, through cooperation, ingenuity, and sheer determination, had kept themselves alive for over a year. When the boat arrived in Nuku'alofa on September 14, 1966, the entire population seemed to be waiting at the dock. Parents who had buried their sons in their hearts suddenly saw them alive and walking. Mothers collapsed weeping. Fathers embraced their boys with trembling arms. The reunion scenes were overwhelming. For 6 days, the entire island nation celebrated. Feasts were held. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered. The boys were heroes, proof that miracles still happened in the modern world. Consequences and complications, but the celebration came to an abrupt halt on the 7th day. The boys were arrested. Tanyela Eula, the owner of the boat they had stolen, demanded justice. His boat had been wrecked on Atta's shores. He wanted compensation, and he wanted the boys punished for theft. The police had no choice but to take them into custody. Warner was furious. These boys had survived an impossible ordeal, and now they were being thrown in jail. It seemed unconscionably cruel. But he had an idea. Warner contacted Australian television, specifically Channel 7 in Sydney. He pitched them an extraordinary documentary. They would take the boys back to Atta, film them demonstrating how they had survived, and tell their story to the world. Channel 7 agreed immediately. They paid Warner £150, about $200 at the time, for the rights to film the story. Warner took that money, bought a new boat for Eula, and secured the boys' release from jail. The resulting documentary, The Castaways, was filmed in October 1966 with the boys returning to Atta to recreate their 15-month ordeal. The footage showed them making fire, building shelters, catching fish with their bare hands, and explaining their survival techniques. It became a sensation in Australia and New Zealand. But Warner didn't stop there. Recognizing that the boys had no interest in returning to boarding school, he offered them jobs. He commissioned a new fishing boat, which he named Atta in honor of the island, and hired all 6 boys as crew. For the next several years, Warner became a father figure to the boys. He taught them navigation, seamanship, and business. In return, their families taught him the secrets of where and how to fish for rock lobster in Tongan waters. The King of Tonga, impressed by Warner's compassion, granted him exclusive fishing rights in Tongan waters. Warner eventually moved to Tonga permanently, establishing a commercial lobster fishing operation that employed dozens of local people. He spent the next 30 years living in the Pacific, raising his own family alongside the boys he had rescued, who had become like sons to him. The 6 boys went on to lead remarkable lives. Sione Fatawa became a Christian minister and is now the head of the Church of Tonga in America. Mano Totau trained as a chef and moved to Australia, where he and Warner remained best friends for over 50 years, sailing together whenever they could. The others found work in shipping, fishing, and various trades throughout the Pacific. But their story, the real story of what happened on Atta, was gradually forgotten by the wider world. The documentary existed, but it wasn't widely distributed. The boys returned to normal life. Warner continued his work in Tonga. Years passed, then decades. Rediscovery and legacy. In 2020, Dutch historian Rutger Bregman was researching a book about human nature when he stumbled upon a brief mention of the Atta castaways. Intrigued, he tracked down Mano Totau and Peter Warner and interviewed them extensively about their experience. Bregman published a chapter about the boys in his book Humankind, A Hopeful History, contrasting their story with William Golding's famous novel Lord of the Flies. In Golding's book, British schoolboys stranded on a deserted island descend into savagery, violence, and murder. The Tongan boys' real-life experience was the opposite. They cooperated, created rules, resolved conflicts peacefully, and maintained their humanity throughout their ordeal. Where Golding's fictional boys became monsters, the Tongan boys became better versions of themselves. When Bregman's article was published in The Guardian in May 2020, it went viral. 7 million people read it within days. The story resonated powerfully during the COVID-19 pandemic, when people were hungry for examples of human cooperation and resilience. Hollywood studios immediately began bidding for the film rights. The story of the Atta castaways was being rediscovered by a new generation, over 50 years after the boys' rescue. In 2015, Spanish explorer Álvaro Cerezo had traveled to Atta with Colo Foquito, one of the original castaways. They spent 10 days on the island, surviving exactly as the boys had done in 1965. Cerezo filmed their experience and interviewed Colo extensively about the original ordeal. The resulting documentary, released in 2020, brought new visual life to the story. Peter Warner, by then 89 years old, was thrilled to see the story receive renewed attention. He had always believed it was important, proof that young people, when faced with adversity, could rise to extraordinary heights. Tragically, Warner never saw the story reach its full modern audience. On April 13, 2021, while sailing near the mouth of the Richmond River in Ballina, New South Wales, his boat was hit by a rogue wave. Warner and his teenage crew member were both swept overboard. The boy survived and managed to pull Warner to shore, but couldn't revive him. Peter Warner drowned doing what he loved, sailing on the open ocean. He was 90 years old. In a way, it was a fitting end for a man who had spent his entire life at sea, who had run away from wealth and privilege to live a life of adventure, and who had twice rescued marooned sailors, first the 6 Tongan boys in 1966, then 4 more castaways he found stranded on Middleton Reef in 1974. What the story teaches us. The story of the Atta castaways challenges many of our assumptions about human nature. We've been taught by books like Lord of the Flies that humans, when stripped of civilization's constraints, revert to violence and chaos. That given the opportunity, we become savage. That the veneer of civilization is thin, and beneath it lurks the beast. But the Tongan boys proved otherwise. When asked years later how they managed to survive so well, Sione Fatawa said simply, "I think the culture where we come from. We are close. Really close family. We share everything. We poor, but we love each other." They survived because they cooperated. They established rules. They divided labor. When conflicts arose, they found ways to resolve them peacefully. They looked after each other, especially the younger boys. They maintained their faith and their humanity. Perhaps most importantly, they never gave up hope. Even when 4 ships passed by without seeing them, even when it seemed they might spend the rest of their lives on that island, they kept the fire burning. They kept watch. They kept believing that someone would come. And someone did. An Australian adventurer and fisherman who had run away from wealth to live on the ocean, who happened to be passing by at exactly the right time, who noticed something unusual on an abandoned island, and who cared enough to investigate. Peter Warner and the 6 Tongan boys formed bonds that lasted over 50 years. They became family, not by blood, but by shared experience and genuine affection. Warner gave the boys opportunities they never would have had otherwise, and they gave him purpose and deep friendship. Their story is a reminder that the ocean, for all its dangers, can also bring people together in unexpected ways. That adventure and risk can lead to profound connections. That young people, even when they make terrible mistakes, like stealing a boat, are capable of extraordinary resilience and growth. Today, the survivors of the Atta ordeal are in their 70s. Most still live in Tonga or have moved to Australia and the United States. They remain in touch with each other and with Warner's family. The island of Atta remains uninhabited, a steep volcanic rock rising from the Pacific. The ruins of the boys' shelters are long gone, reclaimed by the jungle. But the island stands as a monument to an extraordinary chapter in human survival. A place where 6 boys became men, where desperation transformed into cooperation, and where the worst mistake of their young lives became their greatest achievement. Their story has inspired books, documentaries, and soon perhaps a major motion picture. It's taught in schools as an example of human resilience and cooperation. It's cited by psychologists and anthropologists as evidence that our better nature can emerge even in the worst circumstances. But for those who lived it, the story is simpler. As Mano Totau said in 2020, "I think that we feel strongly in us that we have something to helping one another, teaching one another on it." They were just boys who made a mistake, found themselves in an impossible situation, and chose to survive together rather than die alone. And an Australian fisherman named Peter Warner, who noticed some burned grass on a deserted island and decided to investigate, gave them the chance to come home and tell their story. Sometimes, that's all it takes: cooperation, hope, and someone who cares enough to look closer. If you liked the fisherman's story, hit the like button, subscribe for more, and share this story with your friends.